Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for inviting me to do this. So for this paper, I am going to talk about particular borders, and the ones I'm focusing on are the liminal spaces occupied by those uncanny species existing on the boundary between human and creature, between natural and supernatural, thus eluding or slipping through what Victor Turner calls the network of classifications that normally locate states and positions in cultural space. So there's evidence in Tolkien's essay Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics that he was engaging with creatures who are less easily definable in terms of species identity. On Grendel, Tolkien observes that change and blending are, of course, already apparent. Monsters of more or less human shape were naturally liable to development in contact with Christian ideas of sin and spirits of evil. And later in that essay, he explains that the distinction between a devilish ogre and a devil revealing himself in ogre form is a real and important one. Here, Tolkien is examining the boundaries blurred by the monsters that inhabit a liminal space within a text, a concept he was to explore further with species like the orcs, monstrous yet anthropomorphic beings. In the Middle-earth legendarium, there are several examples of characters who blur the boundaries between species through shape-shifting or skin changing. So this paper will examine two of the most liminal of species to be found in Tolkien's writing, instantly recognizable representatives of the uncanny, icons of the horror fantasy genre and popular culture, the vampire and the werewolf. In the Silmarillion, Tolkien often refers to the wolves of the First Age as werewolves, including Draugluin, a werewolf in the service of Sauron who, quote, fed on the flesh of man and elf. In this time, Sauron captures the fortress of Tol Sirion, now called Tol in Gaurhoth, which translates as Isle of the Werewolves. Here he becomes, quote, a sorcerer of dreadful power, master of shadows and of phantoms, misshaping what he touched, twisting what he ruled, lord of werewolves. Sauron also, quote, took upon himself the form of a werewolf and made himself the mightiest that had yet walked the world. In this fortress, situated in that liminal space between life and perversion of life, Sauron breeds the werewolves that appear throughout the legendarium. In the Fellowship of the Ring, for example, Gandalf mentions them to Frodo as being amongst Sauron's servants in the late Third Age. Draugluin's descendant was Carcharoth, the guardian of Angband, whom Sauron fed with living flesh, possibly of captured men and elves, and who, in the year 466 of the First Age, bit off the hand of Beren that held the Silmaril. Given the similarities apparent in the narrative, it is probable that the wargs of the Third Age are bred from Carcharoth. Both he and Draugluin could speak, suggesting a level of sentience greater than a usual wolf, but also emphasizing their liminal state between animal and human. Where does all this come from? In European folkloric context, in stories such as the skinwalkers of the 13th century Icelandic Volsunga saga or the 12th century Slavic tale of Igor's campaign, werewolves are usually depicted as shapeshifters moving between human and wolf form. The exact etymology of the term is not clear, but it may derive from the Old English werewolf, which translates simply as man-wolf. Significantly, in stories about werewolves prior to the middle of the 20th century, the assumption was that one became a werewolf through choice. The process varied according to local law, but the recurring theme was of some form of agreement with the devil or communing with evil spirits. This satanic allegiance was believed to be for various nefarious ends, including the sating of a craving for human flesh, a desire that situates the werewolf as abject and other. A 13th century Latin text called The Wonders of Ireland contains several lines devoted to de hominibus qui se vertunt in lupos, or men who change themselves into wolves. Reproduced here in translation, the text describes men of the Celtic race who, quote, can at will change themselves into the shape of wolves with sharp, tearing teeth, and often thus transformed will they fall upon poor defenceless sheep, and with much amaze have they been espied in human form, with gobbets of raw bleeding flesh champed in their jaws. reflecting the conqueror's perception of the native inhabitants. Depicting the Irish as other not only confirms the superiority of the victors, but also offers justification for the invasion of another country. Conquering such heathens is clearly a necessity if such horrific practices are not to spread among civilized people. The naming of this shapeshifting as evil implies that the Celts are somehow in league with the devil, thus justifying not only their conquering but any methods used in the process. The oldest legends describe many different methods of becoming a werewolf, all of them voluntary. One way was to simply remove all your clothing and either put on a belt made of wolfskin or instead the entire pelt. Another popular method was a magic salve rubbed into the skin while naked. Drinking water out of the footprint of the animal in question or from certain enchanted streams was also considered an effective mode of achieving metamorphosis. Richard Verstegen, a prolific writer of religious texts in the 16th and 17th centuries, writes that the werewolves are certain sorcerers who, having anointed their bodies with an ointment which they make by the instinct of the devil, and putting on a certain enchanted girdle, does not only unto the view of others seem as wolves, but to their own thinking have both the shape and nature of wolves, so long as they wear the same girdle. Now, there's an explicit association here with the devil. According to prevailing opinion of the time, lycanthropy, becoming a werewolf, was a conscious choice made by a person deliberately setting themselves outside the norm, intentionally becoming other, and perpetrating an act of treachery against God. The concept of metamorphosis, the transformation of the body from one state to another, was really disturbing for 12th and 13th century theologians. This was a time of metaphysical anxiety, deeply embedded in the religious consciousness of the time, in which issues of personal identity and a fixation with accounting for change were of great concern. This obsession was a fear of metempsychosis, a loss of self through loss of body, a pervasive conviction underlying many genres and divergent discourses of the period that the human person is a psychosomatic unit whose survival necessitates bodily continuity. This concept was linked with theological concerns about the soul and how the body decays but the soul does not, predicated on a Roman Catholic understanding that self is a separate identity from soul. The survival of the soul beyond the decay of the body required divine intervention, which was therefore a victory over change through God's intercession. This principle of the resurrection of the soul rejected any notion of metamorphosis of the body, which was perceived as a fixed locus of identity. A belief in metamorphosis or body exchange, it was believed, implied that the soul of a human being could be transplanted through a process called metensomatosis into the body of an animal either before or after death. This was widely perceived as blasphemy by theologians who employed the teachings of the Canon Episcopi as proof. Now, this text draws on St. Augustine's statement that humans do not become animals, although demonic intervention may give the illusion of change. Dennis Kratz observes that Augustine's position on this point was so strictly adhered to that St. Boniface, writing almost 300 years later, listed belief in werewolves as a work of the devil that Christians must renounce. The root cause of this anxiety about species immutability lay in a Catholic worldview that laid down the hierarchy of all natural beings, with humans at the top, a position that could also be made to fit the equally fixed social hierarchy. When the Cathars in the 12th century challenged the Catholic Church by positing a pantheistic doctrine, this was condemned as blasphemous, as it suggested that all living things were equally blessed by God, a concept that went to the heart of contemporary belief in a natural hierarchy. Concern over this issue of metamorphosis became so great that it led to what might be called a werewolf renaissance, in which prominent writers such as Gerald of Wales, Gervase of Tilbury, and later William of Auvergne reported stories of lycanthropy as fact, and which also saw the revival of the werewolf motif in imaginative literature. So what's Tolkien doing? He seems to be using the term werewolf as the nearest literary equivalent for his own wolves, as despite their ability to speak in a recognizably human language, there's no textual evidence that they can change their shape from the wolf form. Tolkien has made them werewolves rather than just wolves, both because they're sentient and because they're inhabited by dark spirits. Now, this is alluded to in the Lay of Leithian, in which werewolves, quote, in wolvish form and flesh were clad, but demon spirits dire did hold. Sauron uses these spirits, or Fëa, as part of the process of making this species. And whatever their origins, they are uncanny. They're creatures inhabiting the borderland between species, or as Barbara Creed refers to them, a collapse of human and animal. So neither this nor specifically that. Although Tolkien never actually refers to the wargs of the Third Age as werewolves, Tom Shippey identifies their nomenclature, which is a combination of the Anglo-Saxon hwyr and the Norse vargr, as, quote, a shifting of meaning from wolf to human outlaw. Now, this indicates that they are descended from Sauron's First Age werewolves, and they too are liminal creatures, appearing for the first time in the Fellowship of the Ring in Frodo's dream of Gandalf's escape from Orthanc, in which he hears, quote, the howling of many wolves. When Frodo encounters wargs after the abortive attempt to climb Carathras, it is still not clear what form they inhabit. J.E.A. Tyler identifies them as, quote, phantasms, which only assumed real and deadly shapes after darkness had fallen. So there's certainly a supernatural aspect to these wargs, as at daybreak, there's no sign of the bodies of those killed during the night. As Gandalf tells the Fellowship, these were no ordinary wolves. According to C.R. Stimson, Tolkien's werewolves are, quote, deadly and associated with the sterile and non-creative trolls and orcs. Unlike the giant spiders that inhabit Mirkwood, they have no progenitor in Middle-earth. As neither Morgoth nor Sauron can create, only breed or manufacture, there are two possibilities for the existence of werewolves. Either they are fallen Maiar, as Balrogs were, or more likely, they've been bred from wolves and other humanoids, such as men, elves, or orcs. Now, an extension of this idea is that they may have been bred from Sauron himself, because although Sauron cannot create new life, he is a Maiar, and it is documented that Maiar can have children, even with another species. The Silmarillion offers the example of Melian, a Maiar who enters Middle-earth early in the First Age and is the mother of Luthien, whose father, Thingol, is an elf. Sauron certainly has a great affinity for wolves and can even assume wolf form. Wolf Sauron is the name of the shape he takes when he leaves Tol in Garhoth to do battle with Huan, the Hound of Valinor. As a Maiar, Sauron is capable of changing form at will, and during the battle, he, quote, shifted shape from wolf to serpent and from monster to his own accustomed form. So here we encounter the second liminal creature. In defeat, Sauron flees, taking, quote, the form of a vampire, dripping blood from his throat upon the trees, and he comes to Tawr na Fuin and dwells there, filling it with horror. In choosing the form of a vampire, Tolkien thus continues to identify Sauron with the uncanny. According to a collective understanding of vampires in popular culture, they infect the victim through their bite, either killing them outright or transforming them through a process of miscegenation into facsimiles of the infecting creature. In the case of popular texts that are primarily aimed at the teenage dark romance market, such as Stephanie Meyer's Twilight series, werewolves and vampires are represented as dangerously attractive, their bite something to be welcomed, even actively sought. Now, in contrast, Donna J. Haraway's reading of the vampire figure, as presented in her work with the amazing title, modest _ witness at second _ millennium point female man copyright sign _ meets _ onco mouse trademark sign. It's quite the title. She certainly does not match any representation commonly encountered in popular culture. Instead of being identified as a creature of evil, which drains blood and therefore the life force from its victims, or a creature of romance, brooding and attractive, Haraway's vampire is a symbol for the threat perceived by those who fear or hate the removal of racial boundaries. In an interview with Thurza Nichols Goodeve, Haraway uses this figure to, quote, explain how boundaries and communities of race, nation, nature, language, and culture transmitted by blood and kinship have never disappeared from popular racialism in the United States. Nina Auerbach explores this cultural reading in Our Vampires, Ourselves, in which she posits that each generation acquires the vampire it deserves. Auerbach's vampire is therefore a reflection of the fears that have defined successive generations, from racial integration to terrorism. Haraway's message is that the vampire, quote, both promises and threatens racial and sexual mixing as it, quote, drinks and infuses blood in a paradigmatic act of infecting whatever poses as pure. Haraway's vampire, therefore, is the ultimate agent of miscegenation, as, quote, once you have been drunk from by a vampire, you are not the same kind of entity. For Auerbach, vampires, quote, inhere in our most intimate relationships. They are also hideous invaders of the normal. They can be everything we are, while at the same time they are fearful reminders of the infinite things we are not. My apologies. Haraway's vampire troubles cultural and racial boundaries, attacking, biting, mixing blood, and thus threatening racial purity in its act of miscegenation. It creates new creatures in its own image from the pure body of the victim. She describes it, quote, as a figure that both promises and threatens the racial and sexual mixing. But the vampire also insists on the nightmare of racial violence behind the fantasy of purity in the rituals of kinship. Some critics, however, have pointed out that Haraway's use of the vampire as a symbol is problematic. Carlos Salinas, for example, comments that he, quote, cannot help thinking that the vampire figure that she aligns herself with and uses to counter American figures of racism is shot through with racial undertones as well, a black figure prowling in the dark. In terms of Tolkien's writing, we must look to the characters of Morgoth and Saruman to discern a similarity with Haraway's vision of the vampire as a figure that transgresses borders. For example, if the account given in the Silmarillion is accepted, Morgoth deliberately blurs the boundaries between races in making the orcs. The innocent victim in this case is the elf, whose body is attacked through the means of torture, gradually changing over time into the orc, not necessarily a creature in Morgoth's own image, but certainly one that reflects his proclivity for evil. Even if another version of their origins is preferred, and I've listed some places where you can find those, that they were made from stone or bred from men, as Tolkien sometimes stated, this remains a species developed through the mixing of races. When Saruman breeds the Uruk-hai by mixing the blood of orcs and men, there may be no discernible innocent victim, although there is the suspicion that breeding might be achieved through the result of rape, but this unquestionably still confuses the boundaries between species. Besides this deliberate breeding program, there are other instances of species commingling and producing offspring who therefore straddle that boundary between two species. Interracial marriages between men and elves occur in both the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings, and each time they provoke poor reactions from relatives of the couple, and they produce mixed race progeny. Ultimately, of course, it is the author who blurs these racial boundaries by creating these situations within his writing. As creator of his world and of the creatures within it, it is Tolkien here that is the instrument of miscegenation. Other vampiric readings may be found in the Ringwraiths, whose fear of water, weakness in sunlight, and desire for the blood of the living closely mirror the descriptions of Dracula in Bram Stoker's novel. Strider's description of them in The Fellowship of the Ring, that, quote, at all times they smell the blood of living things, desiring and hating it, seems to confirm this. This desire for blood appears increasingly vampiric when we consider the story told by Gandalf during the Council of Elrond, detailing how he lost sight of Gollum. The woodmen, he says, said that there was some new terror abroad, a ghost that drank blood. Now, this ghost is unlikely to be Gollum, who shows no consequent desire for the blood of humans. Instead, if we turn to the unfinished tales, we find that there is a Ringwraith who remains in Mirkwood, in Dol Guldur, even after Sauron has departed for Barad-dûr. This is Khamûl, the Easterling and the second in command of the Nazgûl. He is the Ringwraith who confronts both Gaffer Gamgee and Farmer Maggot, but does not attempt to enter their homes, perhaps because, like Dracula, he cannot without invitation. There are many other vampiric parallels between the Nazgûl and Dracula. fading into undeath of those that they attack, their cursed undead state, and the loss of free will to their domination. Also, as Sue Zlosnik argues, the scene of the ultimate defeat of Dracula is echoed remarkably in the destruction of the Witch King. Both are slain by the piercing strike of a blade, and not by one person alone, but by two heroes together, Morris and Harker in the stabbing of Dracula, Merry and Eowyn in the stabbing of the Witch King. In the moment of destruction, both Dracula and the Witch King are swept away in a passing dust of nothingness. The more literal figure of the vampire occurs only briefly in Tolkien's work and closely mirrors a common literary view of such a creature. Well, for example, actual vampire bats follow the orc hordes into the Battle of Five Armies in The Hobbit, and they feed upon the fallen. In the Silmarillion, Sauron takes the shape of a vampire on at least one occasion when he flees from Huan, the great hound of Valinor, dripping blood from his throat upon the trees. The best example, though, is the figure of Thurin Wethil, who appears in the chapter of Beren and Luthien. She is Sauron's bat-winged and iron-clawed messenger who conducts his errands between Tol in Gaurhoth and Angband. Tolkien offers little detail in the text about Thurin Wethil, whose name means woman of secret shadow or she of hidden shadow, which again confirms her liminal status. As Tolkien describes her as capable of changing her shape at will, she may have been a fallen Maya, one of the many in Morgoth's service in this time. Tolkien does not explicitly define her as vampire, but as taking on vampire form. She is, quote, wont to fly in vampire's form to Angband, and her great fingered wings are bared at each joint's end with an iron claw. Unlike Tolkien's werewolves, Thurin Wethil is a shape changer, transforming intentionally into her bat-like form. Her fate is unclear. She is caught at Tol in Gaurhoth, where her winged fell is taken from her by Luthien. In Thurin Wethil's shape, Luthien makes her way with Beren, who is, quote, arrayed now in the hame of Draugluin, and thus in werewolf form, to Angband, to retrieve the Silmarils from Morgoth's Iron Crown. Nowhere in the narrative or in the history of Middle-earth is it made explicit that Thurin Wethil is dead, or how her winged shape is taken from her, or what the removal of her fell might leave behind. Shape-shifting, as discussed earlier, is itself a form of boundary crossing. Transitioning from one shape to another, Luthien's body is changed from the natural to the supernatural, thus troubling our reading of the character. This is echoed by Beren's reaction when he first sees her, arrayed as Thurin Wethil, as he is confronted by the horrifying figure of a vampire which chillingly speaks with Luthien's voice. Unsurprisingly, this blended form dismays him, and he believes her to be, quote, a phantom for his ensnaring. It is only when Luthien casts off her disguise, returning to a familiar and accepted shape, that Beren can greet her. It is significant that this incident occurs on a boundary, a physical border territory between the wastelands that Beren has travelled into, having attempted to leave Luthien behind, and the green forest from which Luthien reappears. In this moment, Luthien, caught for a time between one species and another, rejoins Beren, quote, between the desert and the wood, symbolizing the hope that the forest brings to the desert and the threat posed by the desert to the forest. The landscape of Middle-earth is troubled by the intrusion of elements of the uncanny and the paranormal, as I have shown. Tolkien offers the reader a world in which there is an inner consistency of reality, a necessary ingredient for successful subcreation, but also the supernatural and the mysterious, the elements of the narrative that are discomforting. Species are created from the corruption of another species. Trees are not merely trees. The land is not welcoming, and border territories are not clear. As Dimitra Fimi explains, Middle-earth is, quote, complex and unpredictable, a fantasy world that reproduces some of the concepts and prejudices of the primary world, whilst at the same time questioning, challenging, and transforming others. Middle-earth is not a safe place. It has a beauty that is an enchantment and an ever-present peril, and many things are not what they seem. Thank you so much for listening.